right, continuing on with our discussion of the Archaic period and the emergence of agriculture in the Western Hemisphere. This is a little timeline that I made of a bunch of the most important. I've got a list here as inventions. Some of these are domesticated plants. Some of these are technological advances, etc. Here, but you can see a lot of what I've already said, and then some of the things I'm going to talk about here in a couple of minutes are on this chart. So this is a nice sort of study item, I would say. By about 12,000 years ago, peopling is complete. That means North and South America are pretty much habitated by then. By 10,000 years ago, bottle gourds and first evidence of dogs, microbotanical maize 8.7, squash at 8, macrobotanical maize at 6.5, the earliest mounds, I think we'll talk about in a moment, 6, earliest pottery 4,500 years ago, chenopods 4,000 years ago, irrigation canals about 3,500 years ago, and beans and the Eastern agricultural complex, or sometimes called the Eastern horticultural complex, at about 3,000 years ago. So let's focus in on Eastern North America for a couple of minutes. I'm going to kind of do a little round robin to different regions in North America. We've mostly been focused actually on Mesoamerica and Northern South America up until this point. Let's move a little bit north here and talk about North America. The Eastern North American Archaic period, this includes Connecticut, this includes the Northeast, but also all of the East Coast, basically, out to maybe the Mississippi River. We know that Paleo-Indian people essentially occupy this region as soon as the glaciers leave. So that depends as you go further north. This means a little bit later. But Paleo-Indian people or Clovis people are living in, for instance, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and even up into southern Maine by at least 12-ish thousand years ago. In fact, the earliest site in Connecticut is in Avon. It was only discovered a couple of years ago, and it dates to 12,500 years ago. So there are people living in this region that early. Those folks, the Clovis people and the Paleo-Indian people, brought with them a bunch of technology that's going to continue right up until the colonial period. Baskets, cordage, spears, atlatls, I wrote spears twice there, sorry for the typo, needles, mortar and pestles, fish hooks, and fish weights. So they bring with them actually a pretty robust technological tool set from the old world that dates back to much earlier. We do see some early horticultural practices by, many thousands of years ago with careful management of the forest using firing and culling of trees to encourage nut production, and then ultimately the domestication of the Eastern agricultural complex, chenopodium and sunflower and some other plants combined with mobility and hunting. And then the really defining feature of Eastern North America are these major earthworks, the so-called mounds, which we don't really get here in the Northeast, but you do get in the Southeast, in the Mid-Atlantic, and in the Midwest, which I'll talk more about. The earliest mound building in Eastern North America, the earliest examples that we see are actually in Louisiana, so in the Southwest, 6,000 to 3,000 years ago. The Poverty Point is perhaps the most famous. We've got Watson Brake here as well on the left, but Poverty Point is very famously. Mound building seems to be linked to increasing social complexity, long-distance trade, different types of hierarchy, year-round sedentism, people staying in one place, new religious practices. So this is very reminiscent of what we saw in the Old World with the emergence of agriculture and then ultimately the emergence of monumental architecture. So think about Mesopotamia, Egypt, other places like that, where we get this people doing these massive projects, and these mounds certainly would constitute that. These massive projects is linked to all these other changes in society. Agriculture in Eastern North America, a little bit more information about that. A lot of text on this slide. I apologize for that. I'll try and blow through it kind of quickly here. But we know that bottle gourds are in Eastern North America very early, and they flow up from South America quite quickly. 4,500 years ago, people are domesticating gourds. So this is where we see, sort of that particular part of the Three Sisters emerge. The so-called Eastern Agricultural Complex, some of those plants, sunflower, sumpweed, quinopods, I already mentioned some of those, happen around 4,000 years ago. Knotweed and maygrass, which are two wild grass plants, show up about a little bit later. We also see increasing social complexity. So new technologies emerge during this time period. Ceramics is perhaps the most important. By 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, we do see the emergence. This is called Vinette pottery here on the left, where you're looking at. This is a northeastern example. The plant you see on the right there, by the way, that is Chenopodium. That's a local, possibly domesticated Chenopodium. But also along with ceramics, we see fish weirs, which is a novel way of fishing that's really productive and important. There are preserved fish weirs were found in the Big Dig excavation in Boston. They found preserved fish weirs like under 30 feet of city soil that dated to like 2,000 years ago. Very cool stuff. This is a picture from Salt's Caves, Kentucky, with a preserved bottle gourd that's 8,000+ years old. So some of those very early domesticates are making their way into North America. Some of the other regions, talk about the Southwest really quick. So Southwest is pretty much defined by maize agriculture, as you would expect, because it's right there next to Mexico. This is the first region in North America to get imported maize agriculture as early as 4,000 or longer years ago. It's very dry, though, in much of the Southwest, so we see people doing some novel technological advances like the invention of irrigation, something we saw in the Old World, but we don't see in many places in the New World. But people are doing that so they can grow maize in very dry environments. Other plants developed here like cotton 1,500 years ago, and some really interesting. I've got a picture of Mesa Verde here. This is in Colorado. I've actually been to this site. It's a national park. It's a very cool place, and one of the most famous archaeological sites in the world, probably. This unique sort of way of building houses into the cliffside. Really interesting cultural traditions in the Southwest. Tied to maize agriculture, but also unique from other regions with maize agriculture. I'm blowing through these really fast. I know this is a tremendous amount of research has been done in each of these regions. A century of research in each of these regions. I'm giving you the absolute, simplest little introduction to them. Let's talk about the Great Plains, the Pacific Northwest, and California. The North American West adopted maize agriculture later than you might think. I mean, if you kind of imagine, I'm sort of pointing to my screen, which of course you can't see, but if maize is coming into the region from Mexico into the Southwest, and then actually it makes its way pretty quickly up into sort of the Mississippi River Valley, but it comes quite late to the West Coast and the Pacific Northwest, and even later to the northeastern coast. So we see some interesting different adaptations in those regions. For instance, in the Great Plains, we see subsistence largely a kind of continuation of large game hunting and really highly mobile traditions that date back to probably to the Clovis period. And that's of course iconic of that region, right? The massive herds of bison being seasonally hunted by people. In the Pacific Northwest, maize comes very late to that region, and so we see actually that region is really defined by fishing, with really interesting social complexity and large houses and interesting labor practices associated with seasonal fishing. And California shellfish harvesting becomes the most important element of subsistence in that region for a really long time in the absence of widespread maize agriculture. And as we saw in the eastern woodlands, people kind of continue again a pretty high mobility hunting strategy around medium mammals. That's a little bit less wide ranging as the Midwest, or as the Great Plains, but still pretty wide ranging until the arrival of maize fairly late. And people do some interesting stuff with maize in the eastern woodlands. It gets kind of adapted into that hunter-gatherer lifestyle pretty fluidly and does not lead in most places except in the Southwest, where we really see those as mound cultures, Southwest and maybe the Mid-Atlantic. We don't see that emergence of like super crazy social hierarchy like we see, for instance, in the Mississippi River Valley and elsewhere. All right, so that's kind of what I've got about that. There's so much more we could say about this. This is really a very basic introduction to a humongous topic, but just to kind of get you thinking a little bit about how complicated this story becomes over this huge span of space, North and Central and South America, and the tremendous amount of diversity there. And I mean, this isn't even getting into like complex societies. We didn't talk about the Mayans. We didn't talk about the Incans. We didn't talk about the Cahokians. This is really even before any of that happens, or simultaneous with those things happening, and just those are such huge topics. They deserve their own focus. So broad strokes, but a little bit of an introduction to what happened in North and South America after the arrival of humans 12 to 15,000 years ago.